So for chapter 12, we're going to look all about cleaning and sanitizing. So some things we're going to look at, you can see some of the objectives, correct cleaners, best methods of sanitation, guidelines, look at 3-compartment sink as well as dishwasher, and then how to store, clean equipment, etc. So what affects our cleaning, what we do? So a couple of things can affect how well our sanitizers work and which is the best tool to use for that job. And some things, the type and condition of the dirt, food particles versus a lot of baked on grease may be very different, have different needs. The water hardness and the temperature of the water. So really the water hardness is sometimes something that is often overlooked. But water hardness can affect how well a sanitizing solution works, etc. You can normally find that information. Either your kind of chemical dishwashing company can help, or your local water jurisdiction can help you with that information. What kind of surface you're cleaning, the pressure needed, how long something needs to be sanitized, etc. are all things that matter to make sure we're doing it right. So any cleaners that we use must be stable, non-corrosive, and safe to use. And again, safe to use in food service, and so we need to make sure they're approved. We should always make sure we're following manufacturer's instructions, and sometimes that's the answer to some questions here with ServSafe, because some things, we don't know. It's not universal for every chemical. It really is going to depend on that specific cleaner, and so the answer may be following the manufacturer's instructions is really the right thing to do for that. Using cleaners only for their intended purpose, and so again, don't use one in place of another unless the use is the same. So a couple types. So we have detergents, and those really penetrate and soften dirt. So we have general purpose ones that kind of can work on floors, walls, ceilings, most equipment surfaces. And then we have some more heavy duty detergent that affects more wax, kind of aged dirt, baked on grease, those kind of things. We also have degreasers, which is really great for getting grease off of oven doors. You can see here kind of backsplashes, range hoods, all of that. Sometimes our burned, caked on grease needs those degreasers. Delimers then are really those mineral deposits, and so I don't know if you've ever seen that in a dishwasher or a steam tables where I really see them a lot, kind of white, often mineral deposit. So delimers are really helpful with that. And sometimes we have abrasive cleaners that have a scouring agent if we have hard baked on food, etc. But we have to be careful with those so they don't scratch our surface of our pan or our food prep surface. So what about sanitizing? So, we'll talk about things that need to be cleaned. Our floors need to be cleaned, our ceilings need to be cleaned, but anything that will touch food needs to be cleaned and sanitized. So there are two major ways we sanitize. So heat, which a couple ways to do that, either a high temperature dishwasher, or let's say you're using heat in the 3rd compartment of a 3-compartment sink. You would need to immerse that item in water at least 171 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 seconds. Again, there are a lot of numbers to know. That's one I would know and really know that number is going to be different than high temperature dishwasher number. But that for this purpose, if you're immersing it in water for heat sanitizing, it needs to be at least 171 degrees, and it needs to be immersed for 30 seconds. And then we have some chemicals, and the 3 main ones we'll look at, chlorine, iodine, and quartz, are chemical sanitizing. And with chemical sanitizing, they can either be soaked in the sanitizing solution or rinsed, wipes, sprayed, etc. Sometimes we'll have a detergent sanitizer blend, which really you can use the same compound for both the initial washing and the secondary sanitation, but you do still need to do that process twice. So what affects the how well our sanitizer works? And so one thing is that our sanitizer needs to be mixed with water to the correct concentration. And so a lot of times you'll have these test strips that you can see here. If we don't have enough sanitizer in the solution, it may be too weak and it may not work well. If we have too much sanitizer, the solution may be too strong, can corrode metal, may be unsafe, etc. So we've got the test kit here, you see. Make sure they're available, make sure that concentration is checked often, and we should change that solution off when it's dirty, if the concentration is too low, etc. So what about temperature? Again, I said the manufacturer's recommendations may come up because every sanitizer is going to be a little bit different, but some really do work at an appropriate temperature range, and if it's too high or too low, it may not work as well. Also contact time, again, same thing. How long it needs to be, and that may differ. We talked about water hardness, and water hardness and pH do both affect how well a sanitizer works. So make sure you have identified that information, and you can work with your chemical supplier to help figure out what's the best for your specific water needs. All right, some things for the chemicals. And again, I don't expect you to memorize all these. I have seen some questions about some of these. So look at it as you will. But with chlorine, you can see if the water pH is a little bit higher, water temperature a little bit higher, pH a little bit lower, temperature a little bit lower. Iodine is the best around 68 degrees, quartz about 75 degrees, and again, you want to follow those manufacturers' recommendations for hardness, pH, etc. So how do we clean and sanitize? And again, this may sound easy, but a lot of people don't actually do this correctly. So there are 5 steps. The first step is to get any of the kind of visible food, per se, off. So anything that needs to be scraped if it's stuck on, or remove any food bits that look like a sauce, wiping all that off before you even actually wash. Then you wash with your detergent, then you rinse with clean water, and then you sanitize. So it is that multi-step purpose, finally ending with air drying. And really you shouldn't towel dry, you should use that air dry process. So make sure you look at this. Food contact surfaces, like I said earlier, must be cleaned and sanitized after they're used, before working with a different type of food, after handling different raw TCS fruits and vegetables. If the task has been interrupted and the items may have been contaminated, you may need to re-sanitize, or after 4 hours that the items are in constant use. And you'll see that come up again. But after 4 hours of being in constant use, you would need to clean and sanitize. So it doesn't happen often, but let's say you were like cutting up apples for 5 hours. Well, after 4 hours, even though you changed the same, you didn't change what item you're working with, you still would need to stop and sanitize it. And that 4 hours is the same thing if you remember back to when we talked about like a ladle or something in soup or dressing, and if that's out all day, those need to be changed every 4 hours as well. So it's the same 4 hours for that. So again, with stationary equipment like a slicer that you can see here, make sure it's unplugged. Take off as many removable parts as you can that you could either run through a dishwasher or do in a 3-compartment sink. And then anything that you can't, make sure you scrape and remove and wash, rinse, and sanitize as best you can. When you have the surfaces that you can't take off, you may just be doing it like this individual is here with a towel on there. That's fine. Make sure everything air dries before putting the unit back together. And again, be very careful with those. It's one of the most dangerous things in the kitchen sometimes. Any equipment that may hold and dispense TCS food must be cleaned and sanitized every day unless otherwise indicated by the manufacturer. So keep that in mind. All right, what about dishwashing? And so there's several ways of going about dishwashing, several types of dishwashers, etc. We talked about layout in the last chapter, and water supply, hot water, all those things are important. Typically we have a separate area for cleaning pots and pans. Any devices that indicate water pressure and temperature of wash, that's important. The protected storage areas is important. We talked about this in the last chapter as well, is making sure that where you're storing your clean stuff isn't going to somehow be contaminated by your dirty dishes as well. So a couple things with machine dishwashing. So if you're using a high temp machine, so again, heat is the sanitizing source, must be at least 180 degrees for that final rinse. If it's a stationary rack, single temp machine, 165 degrees is fine. If it's a chemical sanitizing machine, then typically those work at a much lower temperature because instead of relying on heat for sanitation, they're relying on that chemical. So again, manufacturer's recommendations, you'll see that so many times. Clean the machine often. Make sure we scrape as much as possible and use the correct dish racks. Overloading dish racks is what I see often. People do that and then things don't get clean, so be avoiding that. And then again, making sure things are air dried. Water temp, water pressure sanitizers should be checked often. Again, there are some things in the high temp machines that you can do. There are maximum registering thermometers or the temperature sensitive tape, which they can actually put on like a plate or something, which will change a certain color if it hits a certain temperature. And that's a way you can see when it's running through if it's actually hitting the correct temperature. So what about a 3-compartment sink? So we have the same 5 steps kind of as before, but we have the 3 sinks. So the first sink is filled with detergent and water of at least 110 degrees. Second sink, clean water. Third sink, water and sanitizer. It is important that all of the sink compartments and even the drain boards on either side are clean and sanitized before we use them. So that's important. They also want you to have a clock with a second hand, so that way you can know how long things have been in there. So kind of the same 5 steps if you think about it when we talked about cleaning a surface. That first step of scraping and removing visible food bits as best you can. Then washing items in the first sink, rinsing in the second sink of clean water, sanitizing in the third sink, and then allowing to air dry. It's really that similar process if you go back and look at the steps for cleaning the prep table, etc. So what about equipment that's clean? So once it's clean and sanitized, again, everything 6 inches off the floor, that doesn't change. Make sure shelves are clean and sanitized as well. We want glasses and cups to be stored upside down on a rack. Flatware we want to store with handles up, not the part we eat off of up. Again, all trays, carts, all of that should be cleaned and sanitized as well. What about wiping cloths? So we have these, we have spills all the time, we've got wet and dry wiping cloths. Just make sure cloths that are meant for wiping food, don't use them for other surfaces or other purposes. Don't like use it to wipe up the floor, or if you're going to keep using that, or don't use it for any other purposes on that. The wet wiping cloths for counters, other surfaces, they should be stored in sanitizer between use and changed when necessary. If they are coming into contact with raw meat, fish, and poultry, we should keep those separate from other cleaning cloths. And then dry wiping cloths may be used, you can see here, for plate or food spills from tableware, etc. Keep dry while in use and must not be visibly dirty or have any food debris on them. All right, so what about non-food contact surfaces? So I talked about, the floors, ceilings, walls. We don't need to sanitize those, but we need to ensure that they are kept clean. And so regular cleaning, we want to prevent buildup of dust, food residue, growth of pathogens. We don't want to invite more pests in. So just make sure we're keeping those things clean. This is not a fun one, but make sure, we have a plan in place for cleaning up after people who may get sick. So diarrhea and vomiting may have norovirus. They may have other pathogens that they can spread. So we want to make sure that it's cleaned up quickly, that employees know how to do this, how they can avoid doing this without spreading the illness to others, etc. All right, storing chemicals and tools. We talked about that utility sink often being somewhere else, having a floor drain for dumping that, making sure we have hooks to hang cleaning tools like a mop up so it's not getting moldy or mildewy, or it's not, or I guess it is being allowed to drain is what I'm trying to say. You want to make sure it's allowed to drain and dry. Make sure all cleaning chemicals are stored in a completely separate area away from where food is prepped. And again, never clean tools and sinks used for hand washing, food prep, or dishwashing. And again, we don't want to dump mop water into toilets, urinals. We should have a separate sink for all of this to happen in. When we're looking at chemicals, we want to make sure they're approved for food service operation. So any chemicals that are not approved, don't keep in the operation. Cover or remove them. Items that could become contaminated. So if you need, if you're cleaning an area and you need to move some food items out of the way, you want to move your spices is a great example, so they're not becoming contaminated. Make sure things are cleaned and sanitized and following manufacturer's directions. So chemicals should be stored in their original containers, separate from food, equipment, etc. Really, you just want to make sure it's very obvious that they are chemicals, and we don't want to store food in old chemical containers or chemicals in old food containers, anything like that. It should be labeled, it should be very clear what it is. And none of that should ever be stored above food or equipment. And this is one thing I'll see even on like a line with even like a sanitizer bucket, right? That's chemicals. We don't want to store that above food. So labeling, again, manufacturer's label must include directions. Should be able to read that. Hopefully that's obvious. And if it is transferred to a new container, like this spray bottle, maybe from a larger container of sanitizer, it really needs to be labeled on that. All right, so to develop a cleaning program, first identify needs, create a master schedule, train staff to follow it, and then monitor it to make sure it works. And to identify cleaning needs, look at surfaces, tools, equipment, identify tasks, improve procedures, estimate time and skills. And this may sound kind of boring, but it's really important, and especially to have a clear outline of who cleans what. You know, this shift is responsible for this position is responsible for that. It's really important, or sometimes these things just don't get done. The master cleaning schedule is also important with what should be cleaned, who should clean it, when, how, just to have this all down so that way everyone knows, you know, oh, did the morning crew do that? I don't know, because we have places where people just make assumptions and then things don't get cleaned properly. So that's really important, especially for things that aren't cleaned every day. You know, maybe you have some things that just need to be done once a week. But if you don't say, you know, let's do it on Monday every week, then, you know, it's hard to know, well, was it done last week? I don't know. So you just have to be careful with not having that schedule. That schedule is really helpful. When we're choosing cleaning materials, we want to select tools and cleaners according to the task. Obviously, make sure any protective gear is provided to staff that they may need. So for implementing this, have a kickoff meeting, introduce the program, schedule time for training with your staff. So just make sure staff are aware of why that's important, that it's very clear why we're doing this. And then make sure it's working, you know, make sure there's some kind of accountability for people following the cleaning routines, checking cleaning tasks against master schedule, change the schedule as needed for any changes in menus, equipment, ask staff input, all of that stuff matters. So make sure we're doing that as well. So that's cleaning. Hopefully that was helpful to you guys, and I will answer any questions in class.